Check. All good. Batch counter, please confirm. Shall we start? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rajesh Govindraj. I think आपकी बैच के लिए I'm taking mapping classes, right? So I hope you are familiar with me. So I'm not sure आपकी बैच में मैंने लिया है या नहीं लिया है. ठीक है. Overall, I'll be covering your disaster management part of paper 3. I'm a faculty of geography, disaster management and current affairs environment here in Vision IAS. Yeah, governance also, yes. ठीक है. So I'll be covering this disaster management also. ठीक है, good. Yeah, अभी याद आया. आपका गवर्नेंस हुआ था. ठीक है, मैपिंग भी हो जाएगा. मैपिंग क्लासेस विल बी starting soon. So before we move completely towards prelims oriented, let's complete the mains portion. Disaster management बहुत छोटा सा topic है. So I'll be taking around 3 classes if things work out. Otherwise 4 classes max. Okay, between 3 to 4 classes. अगर 3 क्लास में खत्म हो गया तो it's well and good, है ना. तो आपके लिए भी टाइम बच जाएगा at this point of time. So if you cooperate, let's finish in 3 classes. Let me give you a brief introduction about disaster management, the overall topic of disaster management before we start with the discussion on disaster management. मैपिंग का शुरू हो जाएगा. ओके, सो बहुत जल्दी शुरू होगा. कुछ बैचेस में शुरू हुआ है, आपके बैचेस में भी शुरू हो जाएगा. चलो ठीक है, डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट पे करते हैं. सो ओवरऑल दिस इज द सिलेबस ऑफ डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट. पेपर 3 का पार्ट है. So in paper 3 you have a total of 5 different subjects. First, economics. So that covers around, out of 250, around 80 marks of economics you will find, economics and agriculture related topics. And after that you will find science and technology. Science and technology covers around 30 to 40 marks. So, so then comes our environment. Environment covers around again 30 to 40 marks. So disaster management usually covers around 30 marks. So rest everything would be security. Total 5 topics: economics and agriculture, first one. Second one, science and technology. Third one, environment. Fourth one, disaster management. And fifth one, security. So डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट के पहले यू कैन सी एनवायरनमेंट का जो टॉपिक्स दिया है, उसके पहले है साइंस एंड टेक्नोलॉजी, उसके बाद में है हमारा सिक्योरिटी का टॉपिक है. बट डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट के बारे में ज्यादा कुछ दिया ही नहीं है सिलेबस में. इट इज नॉट गिवन मच about disaster management here, and this is the only thing which is mentioned in the syllabus. In the syllabus it is mentioned as disaster and disaster management. Okay, क्या दिया है? Disaster and disaster management, both are different actually. Disaster refers to the event of damage, जहां पर loss हुआ है, जहां पर disaster हुआ है, that event is called as disaster. Disaster management is basically how to manage that event before it occurs and after it occurs. कैसे उसको loss को कैसे कम करे. This is what is disaster management. ठीक है, this is the overall syllabus. This इतना ही दिया है. तो इसको हम 3 parts में divide कर सकते हैं. We can divide this entire portion of disaster and disaster management into 3 different parts. Okay, 3 different chapters we can say. The first chapter would cover the basic concepts related to disaster and disaster management. Okay, the basic concepts. What are the basic concepts? Like what do you mean by hazard? What do you mean by disaster? What do you mean by risk? Risk reduction क्या होता है? Vulnerability, disaster management cycle, overall cycle क्या है? उसका stages क्या है? In general, we'll talk about this. Just the basic idea, just the basic concepts of disaster related things. Okay, here we are not going to discuss any disaster in specific, and we are not going to talk about any of the measures required in specific. That is just the basic concepts. The first unit. Second unit talks about the initiatives taken for disaster management. Okay, तो इससे बेटर है कि इसको हाईलाइट करो. The initiatives taken for disaster management in India as well as in the world. Okay, overall at the world level क्या क्या initiatives लिया है, at India level क्या क्या initiatives लिया है. We have a National Disaster Management Act, National Disaster Management Policy, National Disaster Management Plan, and few of the international agreements, conference जो हुआ है, and there are certain frameworks to manage disaster, जैसे कि Hyogo framework, Sendai framework, ये सारा चीजें हैं. So we'll discuss about this in the second unit. First we'll understand what exactly is disaster, वो क्या होते हैं, उसका मतलब क्या है, उसका concept क्या है, ये सारा चीजें समझेंगे. Then we'll talk about the initiatives, and third we'll talk about the disasters in India. क्योंकि यहां पर स्पेसिफिकली दिया है ना डिजास्टर एंड डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट ऐसे दिया है ना, सो दैट मींस दैट वी हैव टू स्टडी अबाउट स्पेसिफिक डिजास्टर्स इन इंडिया. ओके, थोड़ा अबाउट डिजास्टर्स के बारे में हमें पढ़ना है. तो इन दैट पर्टिकुलरली नॉट एवरी डिजास्टर, ऐसा नहीं कि एंड टू एंड सारा पढ़ना है, ये तो इतना जरूरी नहीं है. सो बेसिकली वी हैव टू कॉन्सेंट्रेट ऑन फ्यू इंपॉर्टेंट डिजास्टर्स जिसके ऊपर मल्टीपल टाइम्स क्वेश्चंस आए हैं, एंड जो डिजास्टर्स रिसेंटली हो रहा है. ओके, दोज डिजास्टर्स व्हिच आर हैपनिंग इन द रिसेंट टाइम्स, सो वी नीड टू टॉक अबाउट देम. In this we are going to talk about what exactly do you mean by that particular disaster. For example, we are talking about landslide. First we have to study what is landslide, what are the causes for landslides, okay, what are the areas impacted by landslides, and what are the initiatives required, what are the measures required to reduce the impact of landslide or to prevent landslides, क्या क्या करना है, okay, what are the different steps required. So ये सारी चीजें हमें डिस्कस करेंगे, along with if any of the initiatives taken by the government, if any of the things are there, we'll discuss about that, but under each separate disaster का heading होगा. ठीक है, this is your entire portion of disaster and disaster management, 3 different chapters. So for a better understanding of this topic, let me just show you some of the questions asked in these different chapters since 2013. Okay, since 2013 क्या क्या क्वेश्चंस आए हैं इसके ऊपर, ये सारा थोड़ा सा देखते हैं. 2013 to 2021, total 9 years, right? Total 9 years. In this topic of disaster and disaster management, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. In total of 9 years, we have a total of 20 questions. Okay, so 20 questions. But the thing is this, the topic of disaster and disaster management, the questions on disaster and disaster management is not limited only to paper 3. बस ये paper 3 का ही topic नहीं है. It is also part of paper 1 also. Okay, paper 1 का भी topic है. So if you remember, if you had studied the geography syllabus more specifically, सो लेट मी जस्ट शो यू कहां पर मिलता है आपका टॉपिक्स. ये देखो, दिस इज द सिलेबस ऑफ पेपर 1 जियोग्राफी पेपर 1 मेंस का सिलेबस आई एम टॉकिंग अबाउट. सो इट टॉक्स अबाउट द salient features of world physical geography and the distribution of key natural resources and the factors responsible for the location of industries, okay, various economic activities. And there is also a third topic where it specifically talks about the important geophysical phenomena. Okay, the important geophysical phenomena such as earthquake, tsunami, volcanic activity, cyclone, etc. Geographical features and their locational changes in the critical geographical features in flora and fauna and such changes. Can you see? Right? ये जो टॉपिक है जियोग्राफी का, जो स्पेसिफिकली यूपीएससी हैज put it up as a separate topic in the syllabus, this is actually related to disasters. Even though this is part of physical geography itself. It is part of physical geography itself. Physical geography का है. So whatever it is given here, earthquake हो गया, tsunami हो गया, volcanic activity, cyclone, all of this you are going to study as part of physical geography only. But still UPSC, why it has given separately? Because these are the things which are happening in the current context, more currently relevant and important, right? So इसलिए ये जो disaster related topics है इसको अलग कर दिया. And इसके ऊपर usually बहुत सारा questions होता है. So out of all the geography questions, so nearly 40% of the questions come from this area only, but one question is totally direct related to disasters and disaster management. Directly disaster related एक question आता है. जैसे इस साल का question आया था. I am not sure if any of you have seen my analysis of this year. I have taken both geography analysis as well as environment and disaster management का analysis मैंने लिया था. Okay, please if you get time just go through it. है ना, YouTube में it was open for all. So that gives you a better understanding of how exactly the questions have come and how exactly you have to orient your preparation in that particular direction, है ना. तो जिसका पैटर्न के हिसाब से आपको ओरिएंट करना बहुत जरूरी है. So what I am trying to say is in paper 1 there are topics which are related to disasters and disaster management, and every year definitely one question will be there related to disaster. So that means the questions on disaster and disaster management is not limited only to paper 3, it is also related to paper 1. ठीक है. So सारा मिला के मैंने यहां पर एक कंपैरिजन दे दिया. I'll be sharing this PPT with you guys. You can see all the questions asked in both paper 3 and paper 1 till now, okay, in the last 9 years. So there is a list of this. ठीक है. So let's just briefly go through this. I'm not going to go in detail about this. तो आप खुद इसके ऊपर देख सकते हो. You can see by yourself. So I told you we have 3 different topics. एक हो गया basic concepts, दूसरा हो गया initiatives, तीसरा हो गया disasters in India. So basic concepts के ऊपर there are 2 questions till now. One in 2013, another one is 2019. Can you see how important are vulnerability and risk assessment for pre-disaster management? Okay, यहाँ पर question बहुत generally आता है. It is not related to any specific disaster. कोई एक specific disaster के ऊपर नहीं होता है. They talk in general about what do you mean by vulnerability, what do you mean by risk assessment, what are the various types of vulnerability. ऐसे questions आता है. Okay, vulnerability and risk assessment for pre-disaster management. As an administrator, what are the key areas that you would focus on in disaster management? Okay, it talks about the disaster management cycle. So this is the first basic concepts का जो topic है. 2019 में एक और क्वेश्चन आया था. देखो, vulnerability is an essential element for defining disaster impacts and threat to people. How and in what ways the vulnerability to disasters be characterized, and discuss the different types of vulnerability with reference to disaster. So it's totally about vulnerability. ठीक है. सो देयर वाज आल्सो अनदर क्वेश्चन. ठीक है, चलो इसके बारे में बाद में बताता हूं. दीज आर 2 क्वेश्चंस फ्रॉम फर्स्ट पार्ट. सेकंड पार्ट अबाउट द इनिशिएटिव्स टेकन. देयर वाज 1 क्वेश्चन इन 2018, अनदर क्वेश्चन इन 2020. ओके 2018 का क्वेश्चन देखो, डिस्क्राइब द वेरियस मेजर्स टेकन इन इंडिया फॉर डिजास्टर रिस्क रिडक्शन बिफोर एंड आफ्टर साइनिंग द सेंडाई फ्रेमवर्क. ओके डायरेक्टली दे आर आस्किंग व्हाट आर द डिफरेंट मेजर्स टेकन इन इंडिया एंड हाउ डज दिस सेंडाई फ्रेमवर्क इज डिफरेंट फ्रॉम द ह्योगो फ्रेमवर्क. ह्योगो पहले था, बाद में सेंडाई आया है, दोनों के बीच में क्या डिफरेंस है. सो दिस वाज द क्वेश्चन, बेसिकली नेशनल एंड इंटरनेशनल इनिशिएटिव. Second one, discuss the recent measures initiated in disaster management by the government of India departing from the earlier reactive approach. Basically वही है, पहले अप्रोच कैसे था, बाद में अप्रोच कैसे था. So how exactly it changed, it is covered in the second chapter. Various initiatives taken. यहाँ पर भी 2 क्वेश्चन है. So other than this, a total of 16 questions have been asked in chapter 3, that is various disasters in India, and बहुत सारे disasters यहाँ पर repeat हुआ है. Okay, can you see? इस बार there are total of 3 questions, 1 question in paper 1 and 2 questions in paper 3. So all of them about the disasters in India only. तो अभी एक काम करते हैं, let's just list all the important disasters which has been asked in previous paper so that हम इसके ऊपर थोड़ा बहुत ज्यादा डिस्कस कर सकते हैं. So and usually you can also see one more thing, that there have been many repetitions of disasters. So 2013 का देखो, 2013 there was one question. Bring out the causes for more frequent occurrence of landslides in Himalaya than in Western Ghats. इस क्वेश्चन को याद रखो, बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है, बाद में डिस्कस करेंगे. ओके, द फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन वाज ऑन लैंडस्लाइड्स. लैंडस्लाइड्स के ऊपर एक क्वेश्चन था. Drought has been recognized as a disaster in view of special expanse and temporary. So basically, what are the guidelines to deal with the preparedness for likely situation of El Nino and basically this question is about drought. Okay, drought के ऊपर please keep noting जो important disasters है, we are going to identify based on the previous papers. 2015, frequency of earthquakes appeared to have increased in the Indian subcontinent. However, India's preparedness for mitigating the impact has significant gaps. So it's about earthquakes. So there's one question on earthquake. The state of Jammu Kashmir, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand are reaching the limits of carrying capacity due to tourism critically evaluated. This is also a question related to the disaster, like basically overall disasters in the context of mountains, mountain ecosystem or hill ecosystem we can say. तो वहां पर कौन कौन सा disasters होता है उसके बारे में बात करना है. Mountain ecosystem और hill ecosystem, इसके ऊपर एक क्वेश्चन है. Okay, basically the question overall talks about the issues due to the anthropogenic causes of disasters in the hill ecosystem. Okay, anthropogenic causes क्या क्या है, उसके वजह से क्या क्या issues हुआ है. Okay, in the mountains of Jammu Kashmir, Himachal and Uttarakhand. 2016 is one of the years जहां पर बहुत ज्यादा क्वेश्चन आया था डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट में. अभी 2021 में 3 क्वेश्चन है. उसके other than that 2016 has highest number of questions in disaster. There are 4 number of questions. ठीक है, so देखो इधर 2016 में the first question urban floods. Second question, with reference to NDMA guidelines, measures to be adapted to mitigate the impact of recent incidents of cloud bursts. Okay, urban flood हो गया, cloud burst हो गया. Himalayas are highly prone to landslide. Can you see landslides के ऊपर second question? Discuss the causes and suggest the measures. And this is a very interesting question. मैंने बताया था, यहाँ पर भी आया था ना. Bring out the causes for more frequent occurrence of landslides in Himalayas. 13 में आया था. 2016 में repeat, almost repeat है, content same ही है. Okay, second part थोड़ा सा measures के बारे में बात करना है. And major cities of India becoming vulnerable to floods condition. लैंडस्लाइड तो एटलीस्ट 2013 में पूछा था, वो रिपीट हुआ है. 2016 में देखो, इन पेपर 1 देयर वाज अ क्वेश्चन ऑन फ्लड्स, अर्बन फ्लड्स. इन पेपर 3 अगेन देयर इज अ क्वेश्चन ऑन अर्बन फ्लड्स. मतलब इन द सेम ईयर द क्वेश्चन हैज बीन रिपीटेड फ्रॉम पेपर 1 एंड पेपर 3. दोनों में अर्बन फ्लड के ऊपर क्वेश्चन आए हैं. कैन यू सी? So landslides, another question. Okay, urban flood and normal flood दोनों अलग अलग कर देंगे. चलो, urban flood 2 क्वेश्चन है and cloud burst 1 क्वेश्चन है. Okay, we have 1 question on cloud burst. Fine. 2017 में द क्वेश्चन केम ऑन सुनामी. सुनामी के कंटेक्स्ट में क्या क्या मेजर्स लेना है, लाइक द मैकेनिज्म ऑफ प्रिपेयर्डनेस. 2017 में अनदर वन, इन व्हाट वे द फ्लड्स कैन बी कन्वर्टेड इनटू सस्टेनेबल सोर्स. इट टॉक्स अबाउट फ्लड्स इन जनरल. ओके, फ्लड्स इन जनरल. सो वी हैव सुनामी 1 क्वेश्चन, फ्लड्स इन जनरल, ओवरऑल फ्लड्स यहां पर, नॉट ओनली अर्बन फ्लड्स. 2019 देखो, हाउ कैन द माउंटेन इकोसिस्टम बी रिस्टोर्ड फ्रॉम द नेगेटिव इंपैक्ट्स ऑफ डेवलपमेंट इनिशिएटिव्स इन टूरिज्म. रिपीट हुआ है. यस, देयर वाज अ क्वेश्चन ऑन माउंटेन इकोसिस्टम. अनदर वन 19 में सेकंड क्वेश्चन, डिजास्टर प्रिपेयरनेस इज द फर्स्ट स्टेप इन डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट प्रोसेस. इट टॉक्स अबाउट डिजास्टर प्रिपेयरनेस. ये जो फर्स्ट यूनिट पे हम बात करेंगे ना, डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट साइकिल, सो वो फर्स्ट पार्ट में है. सेकंड, explain how hazard zonation mapping will help in mitigation in the case of landslides. Landslides देखो, यहां पर एक था ऑलरेडी. थर्ड वन, अकाउंट फॉर ह्यूज फ्लडिंग ऑफ मिलियन सिटीज, अर्बन फ्लड्स 2020, लास्ट ईयर का क्वेश्चन. ओके, लास्ट ईयर स्टूडेंट्स के लिए मैंने ये स्पेसिफिकली नोट करवाया था अर्बन फ्लड आने का चांसेस है, एंड लकीली दे गॉट the question on urban flood. ठीक है, 2021 का देखो. You will be surprised to see it is exactly almost same question which was asked in 2013 on landslides. Differentiate the causes of landslides in Himalayan region and Western Ghats. Fourth question on landslides. Let me show you the 2013 question again. Bring out for the causes for frequent occurrence of landslides in Himalaya than in Western Ghats. Can you see the comparison? Question is almost same, just the wording is little bit different. Overall question is same, the landslides in Himalayas and Western Ghats. Exact question repeat हुआ है. ये तो पेपर 1 में है. पेपर 3 में देखो, describe the various causes and effects of landslides. This is the second time where in the same year the topic has repeated in both in paper 1 as well as paper 3. 2016 में आया था urban floods के बारे में, 2021 में आया है landslides के बारे में. So landslides appear to be one of the very favorite topic of UPSC, where till now 5 questions have been asked. Out of 20 questions, 5 questions are on landslides only. ठीक है. एंड दिस क्वेश्चन इज अबाउट अर्थक्वेक. अर्थक्वेक रिलेटेड हजार्ड इस बार का जो क्वेश्चन आया था. सो अर्थक्वेक रिपीट हुआ है. एंड लकीली वी हैड कवर्ड एवरीथिंग इन द लास्ट ईयर्स बैच. सो मैंने ही कवर किया था. सो आई होप जो भी हमारा स्टूडेंट्स है, so they had prepared this. I even had said that जो भी अभी तक डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट के ऊपर जो भी क्वेश्चन आए हैं, अभी ओवरऑल लास्ट ईयर तो देयर वर 17 क्वेश्चन, अभी तो ओनली 20 क्वेश्चन आर देयर. एक बार बैठ के लिख दो. आई सजेस्टेड देम दैट प्लीज राइट दीज आंसर्स वंस. जो भी 20 क्वेश्चन है, 50% चांस है कि क्वेश्चन यूजुअली रिपीट होता है. इवन इफ द क्वेश्चन एग्जैक्टली रिपीट नहीं हुआ तो भी टॉपिक तो रिपीट होगा, द कंटेंट वुड रिमेन द सेम. ठीक है. So मैंने सजेस्ट किया था, if any of them had done, so definitely they would have scored well, I'm sure. So I would suggest the same thing for you also. अभी जरूरी नहीं है, prelims खत्म होने दो. Okay, once your prelims is done, once you start your mains preparation again, so during that point of time बैठ के एक बार ये जो 20 क्वेश्चन आए हैं अभी तक, okay, 20 questions which have come in UPSC, so please write answer for this once. एक बार बैठ के लिख दो, पूरा आपका डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट तैयार हो जाएगा. एंड ऑफकोर्स अभी जो क्लास में कवर करेंगे वो भी तो देखना पड़ेगा, तभी आप अच्छा आंसर लिख सकते हो. बिकॉज मेनी ऑफ द स्टूडेंट्स दे डोंट प्रिपेयर डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट स्पेसिफिकली, दे जस्ट डोंट प्रिपेयर स्पेसिफिकली. मतलब सोचते हैं कि ठीक है यार, जियोग्राफी में पढ़ लिया तो काफी है, ये तो ये क्या करना है, मेजर्स क्या लेना है, ये जनरली लिख देंगे. एंड इफ यू आस्क देम, आई एम श्योर दे वुड नॉट नो व्हाट इज द डिफरेंस बिटवीन वल्नरेबिलिटी एंड रिस्क असेसमेंट. वल्नरेबिलिटी असेसमेंट और रिस्क असेसमेंट में डिफरेंस ही पता नहीं होता है. एंड दे वुड नॉट नो व्हाट इज द डिफरेंस बिटवीन हजार्ड एंड डिजास्टर ऑल्सो. ऐसे ही जनरली लिख के आते हैं, मार्क्स भी जनरली मिलेगा. इफ यू राइट वेरी स्पेसिफिकली, मतलब यहां पर इफ यू टेक अप द मेजर इनिशिएटिव सजेस्टेड बाय एनडीएमए with respect to particular disaster. For each and every disaster, there are measures to be taken as suggested by NDMA, National Disaster Management Authority. Okay, National Disaster Management Authority, इसके बारे में भी पढ़ेंगे हम. So this authority gives specific guidelines to manage each and every disaster. इसमें थोड़ा सा भी आप याद रख के आंसर में लिख दिया तो you will get full marks over there. ठीक है. एंड इवन इफ यू टॉक अबाउट दीज टॉपिक्स, व्हाट डू यू मीन बाय वल्नरेबिलिटी, व्हाट डू यू मीन बाय रिस्क असेसमेंट, व्हाट डू यू मीन बाय कैपेसिटी, ओके, ओवरऑल हजार्ड का मतलब क्या है, डिजास्टर का मतलब क्या है, व्हाट आर द डिफरेंट स्टेप्स रिक्वायर्ड टू बी टेकन, मिटिगेशन, इवन प्रिपेयरनेस का मतलब क्या है, ये सारा चीजें थोड़ा सा टेक्निकल वर्ड डाल दो बीच में, आपको सही मार्क्स मिलेगा. ठीक है. वन ऑफ द मोस्ट नेग्लेक्टेड सेक्शन बट वन ऑफ द मोस्ट स्कोरिंग सेक्शन ऑल्सो हियर. फाइन. सो ये जो डिजास्टर अभी तक आया है इसको नोट करो. इसको तो डेफिनेटली हम डिस्कस करेंगे. अलोंग विद दैट विल ऑल्सो डिस्कस फ्यू अदर डिजास्टर्स विच आर करेंटली इन न्यूज फॉर दिस ईयर. तो हमारा प्रेडिक्शन भी होगा उसमें. तो ये सारा मिलकर आपका डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट पूरा हो जाएगा. तो ये है हमारा डिजास्टर एंड डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट, उसका इंट्रोडक्शन. सो व्हाट आर द ओवरऑल ऑब्जर्वेशंस बेस्ड ऑन द प्रीवियस क्वेश्चंस. ओवरऑल ऑब्जर्वेशंस क्या है? ओवरऑल ऑब्जर्वेशन ये है कि लाइक टॉपिक्स रिपीट तो होता ही है. ओके, टॉपिक्स रिपीट होता है. सो इफ यू प्रिपेयर स्पेसिफिकली इसका आंसर एक बार लिख दिया तो यू हैव अ गुड चांस दैट योर आंसर विल बी one of the best if the question comes. Okay, that would be the best way of preparation. Second, overall weightage of disaster and disaster management. चलो इसका भी एक वो है, ये दिखा देता हूं. ओवरऑल वेटेज क्या है? अच्छा, इसमें नहीं. चलो ठीक है. ओवरऑल वेटेज तो आपको यू हैव सीन बाय योरसेल्फ. सो ओवरऑल वेटेज ऑफ डिजास्टर एंड डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट क्वेश्चन, एटलीस्ट वन क्वेश्चन इन पेपर 1 एंड 1 or 2 क्वेश्चंस इन पेपर 3. Okay, one question in paper 1, 1 or 2 questions in paper 3. Overall, we can say up to 40 to 50 marks including both paper 1, paper 3. Okay, we know about the weightage. So if you ask me what is the difference between a disaster related question in paper 1 and disaster related question in paper 3, इन दोनों में कुछ डिफरेंस रहता है? Yes. लिखने का जो तरीका है उसमें डिफरेंस रहता है. The way you write the answer. In both the papers, the question may come on landslide. Okay, जैसे इस बार आया था. Paper 1 also landslide, paper 3 also landslide. What is the difference between these two? In paper 1, you have to write from the context of geography. Okay, you are studying it as a part of geography. You are a geography student. Okay, so what are the various geographical factors responsible for landslides? Okay, why there is increase, why there is decrease, यहाँ पर ज़्यादा क्यों है, यहाँ पर कम क्यों है. You are going to discuss more in terms of geographical factors, geographical reasons. In paper 3, you are going to talk in terms of management of disaster. You are going to see, okay, this is an event, this is going to impact the people, this is going to impact the economy. So यहाँ से losses कैसे कम करना है? How exactly you have to reduce the losses? How exactly you need to be prepared to deal with that disaster? So that is how you have to, you need to answer the question in paper 3. Okay, there is a little bit of difference in the answers of paper 1 as well as paper 3, even though the topic is same. Okay, एक observation है repeat होगा, दूसरा observation है weightage. Paper 3, 2 questions, usually 2 questions or 1 question for sure, otherwise 2 questions. Paper 1, 1 question. ठीक है. तीसरा है कि व्हाट इज द नेचर ऑफ क्वेश्चंस which are asked. So nature of questions, if you can see, it's a mix of both static as well as current affairs. Okay, it's a mix of both static as well as current affairs. ऐसा नहीं है कि पूरा current related ही आएगा. Okay, there are many questions which are totally static in nature, है ना, जिसके ऊपर you don't have to worry too much about current affairs. जैसे environment का section में आता है, environment में totally direct current affairs. इस बार का क्वेश्चन देखो, okay, COP26 के ऊपर था, so and ये जो ग्रीन ग्रिड इनिशिएटिव के ऊपर था, and WHO को गाइडलाइंस के ऊपर था. ऐसे तो इतना स्पेसिफिकली करंट रिलेटेड नहीं आएगा. The question will be static in nature, but you need to give the examples from current affairs. You need to give the examples, initiatives. ये जो disaster context में जो measures लिए हैं ना, ये current affairs पे उठा के आपको आंसर में डालना है. But the questions are not going to be totally current affairs in nature. It is a mix of both static and current affairs. Okay, that is the nature of questions. And regarding sources, there is one CBSE 11th standard book. Okay, CBSE 11th standard. CBSE 11th standard book, which talks entirely about disaster and disaster management. Okay, it's a very basic and वेरी ब्रीफली बात करते हैं. अगर ये पढ़ सकता है तो पढ़ो, आपके पास टाइम है तो पढ़ो. अदरवाइज इट इज नॉट नेसेसरी इफ यू आर फॉलोइंग विजन आईएएस, डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट मटेरियल. ओके, आई होप ऑल ऑफ यू हैव गॉट दिस मटेरियल. नहीं मिला तो अभी आगे मिल जाएगा. ओके, देयर इज अ मटेरियल प्रिपेयर्ड, ए कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव मटेरियल फ्रॉम आवर एंड फॉर यू गाइस. Okay, it talks entirely about disaster and disaster management. This is one comprehensive source. अगर इसको अच्छे से पढ़ लिया तो ये जरूरी नहीं होगा, बट अगर टाइम है आपके पास, पढ़ने का इंटरेस्ट है तो then you can just go through this. And third one would be NDMA guidelines. NDMA guidelines. What is NDMA? National Disaster Management Authority. This is the national authority to deal with disasters in India. And if you go to NDMA's website, for every disaster it has given a specific guidelines how to deal with that particular disaster. Okay, specifically दिया है. And इसके ऊपर direct questions आते हैं. Let me just show you. Many of the questions are totally direct about NDMA guidelines. अभी इन द लास्ट 1 or 2 years थोड़ा बहुत कम हो गया, बट इसके पहले इफ यू सी द अर्लियर क्वेश्चंस, दे आर डायरेक्टली आस्किंग अबाउट एनडीएमए गाइडलाइंस. कैन यू सी, एज पर द एनडीएमए गाइडलाइंस. ओके, एनडीएमए गाइडलाइंस के हिसाब से डिस्कस करो. राइट, अनदर क्वेश्चन, एनडीएमए गाइडलाइंस. यहां पर भी देखो एनडीएमए गाइडलाइंस. राइट, so मतलब UPSC directly asks what are the guidelines given by NDMA to deal with this. अगर directly नहीं पूछा भी, even if you write it by yourself, if the question was very general, कैसे इस disaster को handle करना है, how to handle landslides, how to be prepared for landslide, how to be prepared for cyclone, ऐसा क्वेश्चन आ गया. In that case, if you write, okay, these are the steps suggested by NDMA, as per NDMA guidelines, these are the steps required to be taken, ऐसे लिख दिया तो आपको फुल मार्क्स. ठीक है, NDMA guidelines are very very important. Either it can be asked directly by UPSC or you can write it by yourself by quoting the guidelines of NDMA. So that's why NDMA guidelines are very important source which you have to study. All of you have to study for whatever the disaster, important जो भी disaster है उसके लिए आपको पढ़ना ही है. But the thing is, ये NDMA guidelines है ना, very bulky and बहुत ज्यादा होता है. Each of the guidelines would document would go for like 50-100 pages and all. So इतना ज्यादा डिटेल में पढ़ने का जरूरी नहीं है. So इसीलिए इसका भी कंपाइलेशन हम इसके अंदर दे दिया है. We have compiled the guidelines of these NDMA जो भी for every disasters. So basically, if you read this thoroughly, you don't have to read CBSE textbook as well as NDMA guidelines भी separately पढ़ने का जरूरी नहीं है. But you need to refer to some part of current affairs. Okay, this is something dynamic. You need to update the event which has happened in the last 1 or 2 years in the context of डिजास्टर एंड डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट. ओके, यू नीड टू अपडेट. यहां पर तो आपको काम करना है, तो इसको स्किप कर सकते हैं, इसको स्किप कर सकते हैं. इफ यू रीड दिस थरोली, एंड ये तो आपको पढ़ना ही है. But this is going to be your reference material only. But the primary source for disaster and disaster management for all of you guys would be my class notes. Okay, primary source would be my class notes. I'll dictate few definitions. जहां पर definition है वहां पर dictation दे दूंगा. बाकी सारा please take running notes. Okay, I'll give you the overall structure of the entire topic, entire syllabus को पूरा structure दे दूंगा, एक brief synopsis भी हो जाएगा. तो वहां पर आप थोड़ा सा running notes ले लो, थोड़ा बहुत मैं भी dictate कर दूंगा. So we'll work together, है ना, थोड़ा सा time बचाने के लिए. Keep this as the source, and ये ही आपका primary source होगा, and secondary source would be Vision IAS disaster management material, and third one would be the current affairs, whatever you read in the context of disaster and disaster management. ठीक है, तो अभी बताइए एनी डाउट्स बिफोर वी स्टार्ट. यस, जो भी रीसेंट गाइडलाइंस है इसके ऊपर थोड़ा सा ध्यान देंगे, एंड आपको भी ध्यान देना पड़ेगा. जैसे कि रिसेंटली जो कोल्ड वेव के कंटेक्स्ट में गाइडेंस दिया है वैसे. ओके, विल जस्ट डिस्कस द हाइलाइट्स रिगार्डिंग एनडीएमए गाइडलाइंस. यू डोंट हैव टू वरी, यू डोंट हैव टू रीड देम स्पेसिफिकली. अगर आपको इंटरेस्ट है, थोड़ा सा ऐसे ही टाइम भी है, only in that case I would suggest go and read. Otherwise I'll discuss specifically what exactly NDMA has said for each and every disaster. वो क्लास में ही मैं डिक्टेट कर दूंगा. Don't worry about that. Okay, I'll give you the brief overall summary of the guidelines, and each of the guidelines almost they go in a similar manner. Okay, if you take the different guidelines for different disaster, थोड़ा बहुत specific रहेगा, बाकी सारा general रहेगा. ठीक है, तो इसलिए even if you remember the basic headings वो ही काफी है, and वही करना बहुत बड़ा बात है. For every disaster, please remember few of the headings suggested by NDMA. NDMA guidelines के अंदर जो headings होता है ना, so बस उसी को ही याद रखो, वो काफी है. बाकी सारा आप लिख सकते हो खुद. Any other doubts? अभी आवाज आ रहे हैं, आई होप. ठीक है, so what I was saying, let's start with the disaster management topic, and there will not be a complete dictation. Please take running notes, Wherever it is required, I'll give you the definition headings. बोर्ड में लिखूंगा, आप लिखते जाओ. जो इंपॉर्टेंट एरिया है वो डिक्टेट कर दूंगा, बाकी सर आप प्लीज टेक ए रनिंग नोट्स सो वी कैन सेव सम टाइम. अगर हो सकता है तो 3 क्लास में खत्म कर दिया तो बढ़िया है. ठीक है, लेट्स स्टार्ट विद द फर्स्ट यूनिट, दैट इज द बेसिक कॉन्सेप्ट्स रिलेटेड टू डिजास्टर्स. Basic concepts. So if you see this picture, what exactly do you see? If you view this particular, so this is a picture of a particular terrain. There are mountains here, there are plains here, जहाँ से river is flowing, and there are coastal region, है ना, so where the river is draining into the oceans, and there are also underground part. ये सारा दिखाया है, right? So what exactly do we see here? So if you see from geography perspective, or if you see from political perspective in terms of the economy, you will see the resources available, the benefits available from this topography, right? That is what is economic geography. Volcanoes are the sources of fertile soil, and volcanoes are the source of fertile soil as well as water. It releases huge amount of steam, right? Mountains are the sources of various forest producers and plants and water resources, जहां से streams start होता है. Glaciers again the regions where the rivers begin, and the riverine region जहां से plain से pass हो रहा है. So this is the region where there is a fertile land next to the river banks, and it also gives the scope for fishing and the area for settlements and trading, जैसे Indus Valley civilization and other civilization evolved along the river banks. And near to the coastal region, we have the various opportunities for fishing, farming, trade, है ना, import export, ports, ये सारी चीजें coastal region में है. And near to the zones where the underground zones हो गया, या the zones of fault line, या the zones of the subduction, है ना, in those zones where we have the various other sources like energy sources हो सकता है, geothermal energy हो सकता है, या the water resources हो सकता है, like the water getting heated up and coming upwards, or even the underground water, fresh water. So ये सारा चीजें हो सकते हैं. But if you see the land from the context of geography and the context of resources, you see a very different things. But we tend to forget that there are various threats associated with the same land also. The same land also, the same regions also are responsible for various kind of threats which can result in various different types of losses. Can you see mountain regions, there are threats of landslides. In glacial regions, there are threats of glacial lake outburst. In volcanic regions, there are threats of volcanic eruption. जैसे recently volcanic eruption हुआ था Tonga Island. Along the faults, there are threats of earthquakes. Along the rivers, there are threats of flooding. Along the coastal region, there are threats of tsunami, cyclone, storm surge, coastal erosion. बहुत सारा है. Can you see the same place where we were actually seeing the resources, there are also the threats, there are also possibility of losses which we fail to see sometimes. If we don't see these things, in a long run, such kind of events can result in a very high amount of loss. Why? Because if you see the loss, you will be prepared to deal with that. If you see, okay, यहाँ पर है, there is a fertile land, हम बहुत सारा अच्छा सा एग्रीकल्चर कर सकते हैं, बहुत सारा घर बना सकते हैं, we can develop a city. ऐसे देखा तो you should also see what are the threats associated with it. अच्छा, यहाँ पर river है, maybe there is a possibility of flood here, Maybe it can cause the submergence of fertile land, so that you can take precaution. Right? Life is not always about seeing the positives, seeing the opportunities. You should also be aware of the negatives. You should also be aware of the losses, not in a pessimistic way, but so that you can be prepared to deal with that. So that is what is disaster management. Okay, people, you can say that disaster management, oh yeah, लोग बोलते हैं ये भी हो जाएगा, ये भी हो जाएगा, earthquake हो जाएगा, tsunami हो जाएगा. Should we worry so much about this? जो होगा तब देखी जाएंगे ऐसे. If you move forward, so when it happens, it creates huge loss. Otherwise, if you are just aware, if you are going to be aware and you are going to be prepared for such kind of disaster, when it happens, the losses will be less. है ना? It will result in less loss. Best example हमारा ओडिशा है. The state of Odisha. It has done wonderful job in managing its cyclone. I'm sure few of you students would be from Odisha, so they would know about the initiatives which are taken over there in order to manage cyclones. 1999 Odisha super cyclone, one of the worst disasters India had ever seen. It caused huge destruction. Many people died. Loss of properties, environment, infrastructure, बहुत ज़्यादा loss हो गया था. In the same way, last year or before last year, there was another super cyclone in Odisha. It did not result in same amount of damage. It did not cause the same type of havoc. That's because they were prepared. They were prepared. They were ready to face it. So that is what is disaster management. Okay, it is not something a pessimistic way of seeing things. It is about being ready to face the challenge. So that is what is disaster and disaster management. Okay, so let's talk about few basic ideas, basic concepts related to disaster management. First, let's talk about the meaning of hazard. What do you mean by hazard? What do you mean by disaster? ठीक है, I'll tell you which part you should take running notes specifically. Otherwise, if I am not telling you to take a running notes, you can wait for my dictation. ठीक है, सो जब रनिंग नोट्स लेना है मैं बोल दूंगा. सो अदरवाइज यू कैन टेक द नोट्स. चलो ठीक है. द फर्स्ट टॉपिक, hazard. So earlier what I discussed was the overall general idea of disaster management क्या होता है. So that was just a brief introduction. Now let's come to the main topic. What do you mean by hazard? So when do we say something is hazardous? कब बोलते हैं हम okay, this is hazard, this is hazardous? Tell me. बताइए आप लोग. Any live examples where you have seen where it is written okay this is hazard? कहां पर लिखा होगा? Have you guys anywhere seen this? Give me an example. Where exactly have you seen the term hazard? Roads में लिखा है. अच्छा. Pollution, yes, good. Chemicals, good. Chemical factory, good. और कहां पर है? laboratory, good. Then mining explosion sites, good. Accident zones, ठीक है. Nuclear power station, ठीक है. Pharmaceuticals waste, okay, fine. ठीक है. मोस्ट कॉमनली कहां पर देखा होगा? पेट्रोल पंप में देखा होगा. Okay, I'm not sure if any of you have visited a laboratory or a nuclear hazardous nuclear power plant. ये तो commonly visit नहीं करेंगे, but at least petrol pump तो commonly visit करेंगे. और I'm sure all of you would have visited a petrol pump at least at one point of time. एक बार तो गया होगा, तो वहां पर लिखा होगा. If there is a पेट्रोल का जो टैंकर आता है या in those region जहां पर वो पेट्रोल स्टोर करते हैं, वहां पर लिखा होगा hazardous, right? So what do you mean by hazard then? Hazard का मतलब क्या है? You have seen the label, ऐसे लिखा होगा danger, hazardous waste, hazard, ऐसे लिखा होगा. So what do you mean by hazard then? Does it mean that it is causing damage? No. It does not mean that it is causing damage at this point of time. It just means that it has a potential to cause damage. Say damage हो सकता है या नहीं भी हो सकता है. It might cause damage or it might not. Fine. A hazardous substance may or may not cause damage. It just has the potential to cause damage. It does not mean that it is causing damage at this point of time, or it does not mean that it will cause damage for sure in the future. Not necessarily. ठीक है. Basically, when do we call something as hazardous? That means that particular object or that particular event has the potential to cause damage. What kind of damage? Damage to life, or damage to property, or damage to environment. It can be any kind of damage. So such kind of event or a thing is called as hazard. Hazard does not mean that it is causing damage at this point of time. Remember, पेट्रोल पंप के ऊपर लिखा है, पेट्रोल टैंकर के ऊपर लिखा है, उसका मतलब ये नहीं कि उससे वो ब्लास्ट हो जाएगा अभी, मतलब अभी होने वाला है, तो ऐसे तो नहीं है ना. If you don't use it properly, if you don't handle it properly, if you don't take enough precautions, it might cause damage, but otherwise it will not cause, right? That is what is hazard. Then what is the difference between hazard and disaster? Okay, I'll dictate, दोनों मिला के डिक्टेट करता हूं, रुको. What do you mean by hazard? What do you mean by disaster? Is there any difference between hazard and disaster? See, hazard is basically an event with a potential to cause the loss. Potential to cause the loss. A disaster is basically the event of loss. If I have to make a differentiation between hazard and disaster, hazard is just a potential to cause loss. Disaster, it is the event of loss. मतलब लॉस हो गया, थ्रेट हो गया, डैमेज हो गया, सॉरी थ्रेट नहीं, डैमेज हो गया. इट हैज कॉज डैमेज टू लाइफ, डैमेज टू प्रॉपर्टी और डैमेज टू एनवायरमेंट. दैट इवेंट इज कॉल्ड एज डिजास्टर. Hazard is just the threat, whereas disaster is the event. Can we call any kind of loss as disaster? Do we use any? छोटा मोटा लॉस हुआ तो भी तब डिजास्टर वर्ड यूज करते हैं? नहीं यूज करते. We will use the term only if the disaster, only if the event is causing a very high amount of loss. Right? We will use the term disaster only in the case where the loss has been too high. बहुत ज्यादा loss हो गया. Okay, best example. If an earthquake is happening in a very populated city like Delhi, I'm not sure if any of you know that Delhi has a very high chances of earthquake. बहुत ज्यादा high chances है. अगर ज्यादा हाई अर्थक्वेक हो गया, बहुत ज्यादा लॉस होने वाला है. ओके, लेट्स जस्ट होप दैट वी आर नॉट गोइंग टू फेस दैट, बट बहुत ज्यादा खतरा है, बहुत लोगों को पता भी नहीं है. इफ सच काइंड ऑफ अर्थक्वेक इज हैपनिंग इन ए वेरी हाई पॉपुलेटेड रीजन, ए वेरी हाई एनर्जेटिक अर्थक्वेक, it creates huge amount of loss. That is a disaster. But the same earthquake is happening in a desert area where there is no property, where there is no life, where there is not much of environment to cause damage at all. वहां पर earthquake हो रहा है, same intensity of earthquake, then it is not a disaster. ठीक है? Disaster is when there is a very high amount of loss. Disaster is when there is a very high amount of loss. So such high amount of loss that it is beyond our control. Such high amount of loss that it is beyond our control to cope using our own resources. Our means the people who are affected. We would need some kind of external support. We would need some kind of external support to cope up with the loss. So that is what is disaster. Disaster is when the loss is very, very high, to that high extent that we need some external support and the community cannot cope using its own resource. Such high amount of destruction is called as disaster. एक और बेस्ट एग्जांपल दे देता हूं यूपीएससी के कंटेक्स्ट में. Preparing for UPSC is hazardous. Agree or not? Yes. All of you should agree. Okay, preparing for UPSC though it's hazardous. Because the people who clear UPSC is very, very less. मतलब बहुत fraction of, a very fraction of the total number of students would clear this. Right? अगर clear नहीं हुआ तो it can result in loss. Majorly loss of what? Loss of time, loss of age, loss of money, loss of energy. Right? बहुत सारा loss हो सकता है. At the same time there are also many benefits. Okay, there is no other exam in this world which will give you so much of knowledge, so much of preparation, so much of awareness than anything. ठीक है? But still there are certain losses. ये तो सबको मानना ही है. डरा नहीं रहा हो. This is a truth. Only a fraction of the students would clear this. So basically preparing for UPSC is hazard. So disaster कब होगा? अगर एग्जाम में ठीक से परफॉर्म नहीं किया, you are not prepared much, you have not written test series, you have not written practice sum of questions. Okay, prelims का क्वेश्चन थोड़ा बहुत प्रैक्टिस नहीं किया, ऐसे ही थोड़ा बहुत पढ़ के प्रीलिम्स में गया वहां पर लिखने के लिए, फिर वहां पर आपको रियलाइज नहीं है यार रिविजन कर लेना चाहिए था, यार थोड़ा बहुत प्रैक्टिस कर लेना चाहिए था, टाइम काफी नहीं था, टाइम मैनेज नहीं हो पाया. सो ये सारा बाद में रियलाइज हुआ है आफ्टर गिविंग 2 hours ऑफ पेपर. बाय दैट टाइम यू कैनॉट डू एनीथिंग. द लॉस इज बियॉन्ड योर कंट्रोल. So that is what is disaster. Okay, so I am also telling, please don't wait till a hazard becomes disaster. You can convert this hazard into some event which will not cause any kind of loss, rather than it will change your life, provided that you take a proper path towards UPSC's preparation. That is writing answers on regular basis, regularly revising, regularly giving tests, both prelims as well as mains. So that is what is preparedness. That is what is, we call it as mitigation, reducing the risk. है ना? We'll talk about all of that. So basically, hazard is just the potential of causing loss. Disaster is the event of loss. If you are writing a test in Vision IAS, Vision IAS में बैठ के 2 घंटे टेस्ट लिखा है, तो उसके बाद में आपको रियलाइज हुआ है, ठीक है यार, थोड़ा बहुत रिवीजन करना है, थोड़ा बहुत और अच्छे से करंट अफेयर्स पढ़ना है, या मे बी यू विल हैव टू प्रैक्टिस लिटिल बिट मोर ऑफ क्वेश्चंस बिफोर यू कम बैक अगेन एंड राइट. इफ यू रियलाइज दैट hazard has still remained a hazard because it has not turned disaster yet. You have time to do that. So that time is now. अभी से शुरू करो. Whoever has not started practicing questions, please start practicing. Is that clear? So please write the definitions. Hazard is a dangerous condition or event hazard is a dangerous condition or event that has potential for causing injury to life, or damage to property, or the environment, So what is disaster? Disaster is the disruption in the functioning of the community, or a society causing widespread economic, social or environmental losses which exceed the ability of the affected society to cope using its own resources. So उसके नीचे लिखो the differences between hazard and disaster. Hazard is just has the potential to cause. Basically, it is the threat of loss. It is just the threat of loss. Disaster is event of loss. A hazard is manageable. That is under control. A disaster is not manageable. That is beyond control. Okay, this is under control. This is beyond control. इवेंट हो भी सकता है बट इट इज नॉट कॉजिंग ए वाइड स्प्रेड लॉस, इट विल नॉट बिकम ए डिजास्टर, इट विल स्टिल रिमेन ए हजार्ड. ओके, जैसे एग्जांपल मैंने दिया था, अर्थक्वेक इन डेजर्ट एंड अर्थक्वेक इन ए पॉपुलेटेड सिटी. अर्थक्वेक इन डेजर्ट स्टिल ए हजार्ड because it is not causing a loss. Earthquake in a populated city is disaster. And there is a third major difference between hazard and disaster. That is what is vulnerability. Hazard has no vulnerability. A disaster has a very high vulnerability. Hazard has no vulnerability, मतलब vulnerability है ही नहीं है. Disaster has a very high vulnerability. Then what is vulnerability? It is said that whenever hazard meets vulnerability, it definitely results in disaster. What do you mean by vulnerability? इसी एग्जाम्पल को लेके हम देखते हैं in the context of UPSC. Hazard is preparing for UPSC is hazardous. Disaster is not clearing UPSC. Okay, it is not totally disaster, but ठीक है, फिर भी it results in a huge loss, right? Because there are many people who have succeeded to much more greater level even after not clearing UPSC. वो अलग बात है, वो अलग कहानी है. But they would have faced that disappointment to that great extent, they would think that disaster ho gaya. So usually, at least for some time, you will feel that the loss is very high. Vulnerability is those characteristics which makes you more prone to the disaster. You are in the situation of hazard. You are in the situation of hazard. Hazard में हो आप. There are certain things which you do or don't do, you will definitely be in disaster. You will definitely go through disaster. For example, UPSC का प्रिपेयर कर रहे हो, आपको पता ही नहीं है, ठीक है, टेस्ट लिखना है. You don't know to write tests at all. You don't know to write answers at all. है ना? So prelims का क्वेश्चन प्रैक्टिस ही नहीं किया है, ऐसे ही चला गया. You are more vulnerable to disaster here. ठीक है? So vulnerability is basically the characteristics of a place or a particular group of people which makes them or which makes the place more vulnerable, that is more prone to disaster. Such kind of characteristics which makes them more prone to disaster is called as vulnerability. Another example. Let's say you are constructing a new home. Okay, let's say you are constructing a new home. है ना? तो यूपीएससी क्लियर कर दिया तो अच्छा खासा पोजीशन में है, थोड़ा बहुत सैलरी आ रहा है. सो यू वांट टू बिल्ड होम. ओके, लोन वोन लेके, ऑफ कोर्स यू आर नॉट, लेट्स अज्यूम दैट यू आर नॉट टेकिंग एनी ब्राइब. सो जो भी लोन लेके फॉर योर पेरेंट्स यू वांट टू कंस्ट्रक्ट ए होम. आपके लिए तो बंगलो मिल जाएगा. फॉर योर पेरेंट्स यू वांट टू कंस्ट्रक्ट ए होम. And you have two options. One is at the center of the city, another at the highway. Okay, बाहर. दोनों का एडवांटेज डिसएडवांटेज है. बाहर हाईवे में लिया तो लैंड बहुत सस्ते में मिल जाएगा, बड़ा जगह होगा, बड़ा घर बना सकते हो, since you don't have to spend much on the land. But if you take a land in the city, the land will be smaller, the home will be smaller. But the thing is, those homes which are located on highway or outskirts of city are more prone to some kind of loss. Theft हो सकता है, dacoity हो सकता है, or maybe the region, even though they are outside the city, there might not be some kind of basic amenities. है ना? So if you have to come to a mall or do shopping, you have to travel long distance. वो सारा losses है आपका. और मे बी द लैंड इज सो चीप यू डिड नॉट सी, ऐसे ही खरीद लिया, फिर बाद में पता चला वहां पर फ्लड आने का चांसेस है. ओके, मॉनसून में पूरा सबमर्ज हो जाएगा, पूरा पानी से कवर हो जाएगा. रादर देन द हाउस विच इज लोकेटेड इन द सिटी, which is less prone to theft, less prone to robbery, less prone to dacoity, and less prone to such kind of losses. So what is the vulnerability here? Vulnerability is the location here. The same house, if you are constructing on the highway, they are more prone to the loss rather than the houses which are located in the city limits. Okay, अगल बगल में पुलिस स्टेशन रहता है, ज्यादा कुछ इश्यू नहीं रहता है, सिक्योरिटी का इश्यू नहीं रहता है. So that is what is vulnerability. Vulnerability is basically those characteristics which makes them more prone to loss. Okay, another example ले लो. If you are constructing a house on a mountain slope, they are more prone to landslides. Mountain slopes में usually landslides होने का chances है, rather than those houses which are located on the plains. Right? And those houses which are located near to the river bed, है ना, ऐसे सोच के बना दिया चलो अच्छे से व्यू मिल जाएगा तो रिवर बेड के बगल में ही बना देते हैं. So they are more prone to floods rather than those houses which are located over there पीछे. So basically vulnerability is that situation which makes you more prone to loss. जैसे हम बोलते आंसर लिखो, टेस्ट अटेम्प्ट करो, उससे क्या होता है, vulnerability कम होते जाएगा. There are lesser chances that you will face that loss. So that is why we say in hazard there is no vulnerability, because hazard has remained a hazard. यहाँ पर vulnerability ही नहीं है, like there is no vulnerability at all. But in the disaster there is a high vulnerability. That is why it has resulted in disaster. Okay, in the other example I told you, so where the earthquake is happening in a desert region and a populated city. In case of populated city, the vulnerability is the densely populated community, the settlements which are having a very high density. That is what is vulnerability. वहां पर vulnerability है ही नहीं है क्योंकि there is no population at all. So that is what is vulnerability, which is our next topic. Please write the definition of vulnerability. What do you mean by vulnerability? The characteristics of an area which makes it more likely to be damaged by the impact of hazard. Is that clear? यहाँ पर थोड़ा सा डिटेल में डिस्कस करना है. सो बिकॉज देयर हैव बीन फ्यू क्वेश्चंस ऑन वल्नरेबिलिटी. सो वी डिस्कस्ड व्हाट इज वल्नरेबिलिटी. सो अभी से थोड़ा सा रनिंग नोट्स लिखते जाओ. ओके, प्लीज कीप राइटिंग. Types of vulnerability. What are the different types of vulnerability? We have majorly physical vulnerability. Please keep writing. Economic vulnerability and social vulnerability. Physical vulnerability, economic vulnerability and social vulnerability. So vulnerability is basically the characteristics which makes you more prone to the loss. So what do you mean by physical vulnerability? The physical condition or the physical location of a particular place which makes it more prone to the loss is called as physical vulnerability. Like the condition of the building, the location of people. है ना, जैसे मैंने एग्जांपल दिया था, the house which is located on the outskirts than the house which is located in the city center. The house which is located along the plains and the house which is located along the mountain slopes. There it is more prone to landslide, here it is less prone to landslides. The physical condition causes physical vulnerability. Right? The physical condition of people, buildings, infrastructure, and their proximity, location, and nature. And their proximity, location, and nature. Okay, example भी लिखो. Example, the settlements located along steep slope are prone to landslides. What is economic vulnerability? Economic vulnerability depends upon the economic condition. Economic condition. For example, the migrants who come to cities. जो अर्बन रीजन्स में आता है ना, पीपल हु कम फ्रॉम वेरी फार ऑफ प्लेस, रूरल एरियाज में दूर दूर से आते हैं इन सर्च ऑफ बेटर अपॉर्चुनिटीज. सो इफ दे डोंट हैव मच मनी विद देम, they will find somewhere their homes near to slums and low lying lands which are more prone to losses like waterborne diseases or even floods during the monsoon season. वहां पर मोस्ट कॉमन है, पॉसिबिलिटी है. Why they are facing this vulnerability? Because of less money. सिटीज में जो लो लाइंग एरियाज है, लेक्स है, उसको सारा ऑक्यूपाई करके कन्वर्ट कर देते हैं. ये जो हमारा पॉलिटिशियंस होगा या लोकल गुंडा होगा वो सारा कन्वर्ट कर देते हैं. एंड उसको कन्वर्ट करके दे विल जस्ट रेंट इट आउट टू दीज माइग्रेंट्स बिकॉज दे आर नॉट गोइंग टू आस्क एनी काइंड ऑफ लीगल डॉक्यूमेंट्स, राइट? And since it is not very safe, since it is not very well developed, the place would also be not very costly. So the people who are living over there, they are majorly poor people. Just because of their poverty, they are not able to afford a better place. That makes them more prone to losses like floods or fire accidents or waterborne diseases, epidemics. हो सकता है, possibility है. That is economic vulnerability. Due to the economic condition, what is social vulnerability? Which part should I repeat? So let me complete this social vulnerability. Please tell me which part specifically, कौन सा part repeat करना है. Social vulnerability क्या होता है? The social status of people. The social status of people makes them more prone to the loss. For example, old age people, disabled, women, children. It is the society as a whole is responsible for their status. Okay, in the society they are not given the power, they are not given the resource, they are not given the knowledge. They have been suppressed for ages. The women and the children, of course, they don't have the capacity. They are children. Disabled, they don't have the physical condition. As a society, we have the responsibility to provide the resources for them, to feel them equal with others. But ye to society has failed. And old age, again, it is our responsibility to ensure that they get access to resources. They get access to whatever the kind of basic living, basic amenities required for their survival. But usually they are not. Okay, it is basically a social vulnerability, societal vulnerability. Okay, vulnerability imposed by their societal status. In case of disaster, they are the ones who are more prone because they cannot escape very easily. Even if they escape, if they are living in some areas temporarily, कोई भी shelter home में है, कोई tents में है, they are more prone to losses over there. In terms of security, in terms of threat, in terms of access to resources, वहाँ पर ज़्यादा कुछ नहीं मिलता है उनके लिए. So they are more vulnerable. So such kind of vulnerability is called as social vulnerability. So basically, economic and social vulnerability is about their status. Economic status हो गया in terms of poverty, unemployment के चक्कर में, और social status हो गया in terms of their डिसेबिलिटी. फिजिकल डिसेबिलिटी हो सकता है या सोशल डिसेबिलिटी हो सकता है. Physical vulnerability is basically the vulnerability imposed by the physical condition of that community or the place. Physical condition का मतलब क्या है? लोकेशन हो सकता है, the physical characteristics हो सकता है, जैसे टोपोग्राफी स्लोप है या नहीं है, right? Or in terms of the density of population. So all of this, the physical condition causes the vulnerability. That is what is physical vulnerability. So these are overall types of vulnerability. So if I ask you what are the causes of vulnerability, if you have understood what is vulnerability, you can clearly say. What causes vulnerability? So these are the major causes. You can see limited access to resources, disability, poverty, lack of education, lack of training, population expansion, unplanned urbanization, environmental degradation, dangerous condition, low levels of income. ये सारा different causes, ये तो आप generally लिख सकते हो. But briefly लिखते जाओ. What are the causes of vulnerability? Poverty, limited access to resources, lack of infrastructure, lack of education, lack of training, unplanned urbanization, environmental degradation, जैसे यूपीएससी में not revising much, not attempting the test series, not writing assignments, not listening to the class attentively, है ना, ये सारा चीजें भी vulnerability यूपीएससी के कंटेक्स्ट में. ये सारा मत लिखो पेपर में. So these are the causes. ये तो आप लिख ही सकते हो if you had understood the concept of vulnerability. If I am asking you what are the indicators of vulnerability, what do you mean by an indicator? Indicator means how exactly it is visible, how exactly vulnerability is visible to us. There are various different indicators like physical indicators. In physical indicators, the geographical condition gives us an idea how vulnerable they are. The location, the environment, the infrastructure that shows the physical condition of a particular place. By assessing the physical condition of a particular place, we can clearly come to a conclusion how vulnerable it is, whether it is more vulnerable or less vulnerable. For example, urban settlement which is closely packed, जैसे कि हमारा राजेंद्र नगर है, हमारा करोल बाग है, मुखर्जी नगर है. The homes, they are very closely packed. अगर कोई भी earthquake आ गया तब पता चलेगा. You would take half an hour to come out of the building. And the stairs तो ऐसे घूम घूम के बनाया है, okay, in order to save space. So that is physical vulnerability. It is an indicator. By assessing the physical condition, we can come to know about the status of vulnerability. मतलब कितना ज्यादा vulnerability है, कम vulnerability है. If any particular place जहां पर बहुत spacious बना है, अच्छा खासा space है, okay, the stairs are made very wide and open, there is a fire exit, है ना? So all of these precautions are taken. They are less vulnerable. The physical condition of a place gives a very clear idea how vulnerable a particular place is, or even the demography of a particular place. Maybe the settlements are average, मतलब overall ठीक है, काफी कुछ है, but if there is a overpopulation, definitely again they will take more time again during the earthquake or during any other kind of disaster. More people will be impacted rather than less populated city जहां पर ज्यादा issue नहीं है, ज्यादा easily people can come out of the disaster very easily, right? So that is what is demography. So the demographic conditions in terms of the number, in terms of density, structure, the composition, ये सारा चीजें हम देख के conclude कर सकते हैं by understanding the demographic condition or even the health status of a particular place. Are there any communicable diseases which are spreading fast? Are they maintaining hygiene in that particular area? Are the health services adequately provided in that particular region? ये सारा assess करके हम conclude कर सकते हैं whether this particular region is more vulnerable or less vulnerable to specific disaster. Health condition देख के भी हम conclude कर सकते हैं. Other than this, the economic conditions, economic condition in terms of the levels of income, in terms of the production, in terms of insurance, in terms of employment levels, ये सारा assess करके हम analyze कर सकते हैं okay how vulnerable they are, how more vulnerable or how less vulnerable, ये सारा हम easily conclude कर सकते हैं. Economic condition of a particular place or even the social condition. I hope all of you are writing it down. यहाँ पर discuss dictate करने के लिए ज़्यादा नहीं है. The social conditions in terms of the belief system, in terms of the traditions, culture. ये कैसे? How exactly this is an indicator? Let me tell you. If a particular place, they are socially backward, मतलब they are not well educated. They follow too much of blind beliefs. They follow too much of patriarchy. बहुत ज्यादा patriarchy है, बहुत ज्यादा blind belief follow करता है. So in that case, if there is any kind of earthquake या tsunami हो गया, if we say okay you need to be prepared, थोड़ा बहुत ऐसे prepare रहो, लड़कियों को भी ट्रेन करो, सबको ट्रेन करके रेडी रखो, so if there is any kind of disaster so that you can be prepared. So in that particular village or city where they are not well educated, they are not well aware, they are not too liberal, they might not listen to us. They will say नहीं नहीं हम देख लेंगे, जरूरी नहीं है, they will remain within the homes. Okay, हम भगवान को पूजा करेंगे तो हमारा भगवान सबको बचा लेगा. So ऐसे बोल दिया तो it's because of the social vulnerability. The social status shows that, right? So that is an indicator. By assessing that, we can come to conclusion how vulnerable the people are. Or even in terms of organizational structure. Organizational structure is also an indicator of vulnerability. How strong the organization. Organization means the government, the NGOs, the private sector in that particular region who are participating in training the people, in giving them awareness, in giving them knowledge about the necessity of being prepared for disaster management. If the government is strong, if it is taking enough measures, people would also be aware. अगर गवर्नमेंट ही कुछ काम नहीं कर रहा है तो people would not be definitely not aware. वहां पर ज्यादा vulnerability रहता है. So these are the different indicators. Economic indicator, social, physical, demographic, health, organizational structure. So by analyzing these different indicators, we can come to conclusion about the overall status of vulnerability over there. Is that clear? We discuss what is vulnerability, the basic types of vulnerability, causes of vulnerability and the different indicators of vulnerability. कोई कुछ डाउट है तो बताइए. I guess it's all clear till now. So always remember, vulnerability is that factor which makes you more prone to disaster. जहां पर vulnerability ज्यादा है वहां पर definitely disaster होने का chances भी ज्यादा है. जहां पर people are prepared, people are ready and people have the capacity, there will be lesser chances of disaster. So the next topic is capacity. So before that, let's take a short break and come back and we'll discuss about what do you mean by capacity, capacity development क्या होता है, then we'll also discuss about risk reduction, ये सारी चीजें बात करेंगे overall. ठीक है, let's take a short break. So the next concept is capacity. What do you mean by capacity? So capacity is basically all those things which will reduce vulnerability. Capacity and vulnerability are both are opposite. If you have higher capacity, you will have lower vulnerability. Lower capacity, higher vulnerability. So what is capacity? All the resources, the means and the strengths which are required to enable the community. To enable the community. Community मतलब कौन है? The affected people here. To be prepared for, to mitigate the impacts of, to fight against the disasters. Capacity is very important. Why? Disasters are bound to happen. We cannot stop all the disasters. We will think that ठीक है हम इतना technological advance हो जाएंगे तो we will stop all the disasters. That is not possible. The best example is the pandemic situation which we are in. In spite of such high scientific developments, we are at the peak of scientific development. Okay, so compared to all the previous years, okay, in the last 10,000 years, now we are in the most advantageous stage. We are able to reach moon, we are able to reach Mars and even the edge of the solar system, the Voyager, है ना? We are able to access and see things over there, but still in front of one single virus, the entire world collapsed. It was shut down, right? So disasters are bound to happen because there are many things in this world which are out of our control, which we cannot control. So in such situation where the disasters are bound to happen, we should not try to prevent it. Of course, we should try to prevent it as much as possible, but prevention is not everything. We should have that capacity to face the disaster. जो भी आना है तो चलो देखते हैं. यूपीएससी का प्रिपरेशन भी ऐसा ही है. अब if you think that you will predict everything, you will prepare every question, every topic, वो तो होता नहीं है कभी. कभी भी यूपीएससी का प्रिपरेशन खत्म नहीं होता है. So what exactly is your preparation? Preparation is your mindset, making your mind ready to think and write at that moment. That is what is UPSC's mains preparation. You cannot prepare every topic, you cannot have that every knowledge which is required over there. Okay, your awareness level should be such that जो भी टॉपिक दे दो, मतलब ऑफ कोर्स देयर वुड बी सर्टेन फैक्चुअल इन्फॉर्मेशन टाइप, ये सारा चीजें तो आपको पता ही रहेगा, बट यूपीएससी मेंस इज नॉट अबाउट दैट. इट इज अबाउट यू हैव टू थिंक एंड एनालाइज एट दैट मोमेंट एंड राइट द आंसर. दैट इज व्हाट इज प्रिपेयर्डनेस. जैसे यूपीएससी का मेंस में भी प्रिपेयरनेस इज अ मेजर थिंग, इन डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट इज ऑल्सो प्रिपेयरनेस इज अ मेजर थिंग. फॉर दैट यू नीड कैपेसिटी. तो यूपीएससी में तो चाहिए कैपेसिटी. कैपेसिटी कैसे बढ़ेगा? टेस्ट सीरीज लिखो, चेक योर सेल्फ, चेक योर आंसर्स, करेक्ट योर सेल्फ, कंपेयर योर सेल्फ विथ अदर परफॉर्मेंस. टॉपर का आंसर देखो, आपका आंसर देखो, देखो क्या डिफरेंस है, कहां पर क्या गलती कर रहे हो, तो करेक्ट योर सेल्फ. यू डेवलप दो स्ट्रेंथ्स, मीन्स एंड the resources required to deal with the vulnerability, so that overall vulnerability for you to succumb in the process would reduce and you will come out victorious. So capacity is basically, you can write the definition: resources, means and strengths. Resources, means and strengths which enable the community to prevent, mitigate, prepare for, withstand or quickly recover from a hazard. Quickly recover from a hazard. Okay, there is a hazardous situation. Whatever the resources and means which is required to face that, that is what is capacity. Then what is capacity development? Capacity development क्या है? Developing the capacity. कैपेसिटी को कैसे डेवलप कर सकते हैं? हाउ कैन वी इंक्रीज द कैपेसिटी? थ्रू ट्रेनिंग, थ्रू अवेयरनेस बिल्डिंग, थ्रू स्किलिंग, बाय स्प्रेडिंग नॉलेज, education, research. Capacity development involves, okay, keep writing. Capacity development involves training, skill development, education. ट्रेनिंग मीन्स ट्रेनिंग द जनरल पॉपुलेशन, सबको ट्रेन करना ही है. ओके, ट्रेनिंग द एंटायर पब्लिक. एजुकेशन इज बेसिकली फॉर चिल्ड्रन, schools and colleges. Research, awareness generation, right? So if I'm asking what are the different types of capacity, जैसे different types of vulnerability है वैसे ही different types of capacity भी होगा. We have physical vulnerability, physical capacity होगा. Economic vulnerability, economic capacity होगा. सोशल वल्नरेबिलिटी सोशल कैपेसिटी होगा. फिजिकल कैपेसिटी इज both the capacity of the individual as well as the capacity of the entire geographical region to withstand those disasters, those vulnerabilities. Economic capacity, economic status, by improving the economic condition, okay, by providing better employment opportunities, income generation. Social capacity, bridging the gender gap, reducing patriarchy, providing facilities, equal facilities for disabled, children, old age, LGBT community, सब आता है. That is what is social capacity. ठीक है. इट इज ऑलमोस्ट सेम एज वल्नरेबिलिटी, बस उसका ऑपोजिट है. What is risk? सब वर्ड्स ऑलमोस्ट सेम ही लगता है, मतलब डिफरेंट डिफरेंट है, मीनिंग डिफरेंट डिफरेंट है. व्हाट डू यू मीन बाय रिस्क? Anyone? Chance of success. Anything else other than chances of success? Risk is first step to accomplish the task. Probability of damage to occur. Very good, Priya Sharma. So what is the difference between risk and vulnerability then? Is there any difference between risk and vulnerability? How risk and vulnerability are related? अच्छा, ये सही है. मैं क्वेश्चन पूछ रहा हूं, मुझे भी वापस क्वेश्चन पूछो. पहले बताओ, आप लोग बताओ, व्हाट डू यू अंडरस्टैंड बाय रिस्क? What was vulnerability? Vulnerability was basically the characteristics which makes it more prone to the damage. The characteristics. Vulnerability is basically the characteristics. Risk is the probability. It is the probability. It is the measure of expected loss. Vulnerability के वजह से लॉस होने का चांसेस ज्यादा होता है. So how much of chance is there? That is what is risk. Of course both are related. Higher the vulnerability, higher the risk. जितना ज्यादा vulnerability रहता है उतना ज्यादा रिस्क रहता है. What is risk? The actual measure of expected loss. कितना लॉस हो सकता है? That is what is risk. What is the cause of risk? Vulnerability. Vulnerability is just the characteristics which makes it more prone to the damage, right? So that's why vulnerability is basically characteristic, it is basically the cause, and risk is the result. It is the measure. How much of probability is there? What is the risk in the case of UPSC's preparation? If I'm asking you what is the risk, that means what is the probability of loss, not what is the probability of success. Okay, of course both are related, but risk is something negative, and it is not the probability of success, it is the probability of loss. The probability of expected loss, कितना damage हो सकता है? Okay, you are giving a very precious time of your youth age in this preparation. Okay, टाइम पे प्रिपेयर नहीं किया, बहुत सारा मेहनत करके भी फायदा नहीं होता है ना. यू हैव टू गो इन द डायरेक्शन ऑफ यूपीएससी. यूपीएससी किस डायरेक्शन में एक्सपेक्ट कर रहा है, योर आंसर्स और योर प्रिपरेशन और योर स्ट्रैटेजी, वॉट एवर द स्ट्रैटेजी, वेदर इट वर्क्स आउट और नॉट. सो ये सारा चीजें जिस डायरेक्शन में आपको प्रिपेयर करना है ना, सो दैट इज व्हाट इज the required capacity. With capacity you are going to do that, but if you are going in opposite direction, even though you are taking efforts, it is not helping it. That increases the chances of not clearing, that increases the risk. So how much chance is there out of total? उसको बोलते risk. But in the context of disaster management, बिल्कुल रिस्क नहीं लेने का. See, I'm not saying that we will stop the disasters. That is not the overall idea of disaster management. Disaster तो होगा ही होगा. The event is going to happen. The earthquakes are going to happen. Landslides may happen. Floods may happen. Tsunami is going to happen for sure. Cyclones are going to happen for sure. We cannot stop that. But if you are being prepared to deal with that, if you have the capacity to face that, the risk is lesser. Lesser the risk, higher the chance of success. Right? So risk is basically the overall probability of damage. Overall probability of damage. It is the measure of expected loss. So please read the definition. Risk is the probability of harmful consequences. Risk is the probability of harmful consequences or the measure of expected losses resulting from interactions between hazards and vulnerable conditions. Resulting from interactions between hazards and vulnerable conditions. So here please write this formula. Risk is equal to hazard into vulnerability divided by capacity. R is equal to H into V divided by C. Bigger the hazard, bigger the risk. बड़ा अर्थक्वेक हो गया, ज्यादा लॉसेस हो सकता है. Higher the vulnerability, higher the risk. More poor people are there, more disabled are there, more densely populated, higher the risk. Even with a smaller earthquake, it can cause more damage. higher the capacity, lower the risk. If people are all trained, people have taken all the enough measures, they have taken every required precaution, the overall loss will be lesser. Higher the capacity, lower the risk. So what do you mean by रिस्क रिडक्शन? रिस्क रिडक्शन का मतलब क्या है? We cannot do anything about hazard. Many of the hazards are natural ones. Of course, there are artificial man-made hazards है, anthropogenic causes से होता है, so वहां पर थोड़ा सा precaution ले सकता है. But otherwise, we need to concentrate more on the vulnerability. In order to reduce the risk, you need to reduce the vulnerability or increase the capacity. In both the cases, it results in risk reduction. The overall disaster management is about reducing the risk. Disaster management is about reducing the risk. Yes, that is what I am saying, Ashish. If we already prepare ourselves about the risk and its consequences, then plan. So can we say this loss is reduced? Yes, definitely that is how you reduce the loss. Okay, I'm not sure if any of you know about investing in stock market. स्टॉक मार्केट में इन्वेस्ट करना भी हजार्डस है, उससे भी लॉसेस होता है, प्रोबेबिलिटी तो है ही. बट दे से डाइवर्सिफाई योर इन्वेस्टमेंट. डोंट इन्वेस्ट इन वन पर्टिकुलर कंपनी. ओके, म्यूचुअल फंड्स बना दो. म्यूचुअल फंड बेसिकली इट्स ए फंड, इट इन्वेस्ट इन डिफरेंट बास्केट्स. तो वहां पर क्या होता है, एक जगह में रिस्क ज्यादा है, दूसरी जगह में रिस्क कम है, दोनों बैलेंस हो जाते हैं. देयर इज हायर प्रोबेबिलिटी ऑफ लॉस इन वन, देयर इज हायर लोअर प्रोबेबिलिटी ऑफ लॉस इन अनदर वन. अगर यहां पर लॉस हो गया तो यहां पर तो बैलेंस हो जाएगा, बट एट द सेम टाइम यहां पर प्रोबेबिलिटी ज्यादा है लॉस का, प्रॉफिट का भी ज्यादा हो सकता है. So that is how you diversify and reduce the risk, right? So overall, if you know the risk, overall you know how much of risk is there, you can plan and be prepared so that the loss can also be reduced. Right? So that is what is basically the disaster management. Disaster management targets the risk reduction. Disaster management cycle. What is disaster management cycle? These are basically cyclical steps required to be taken in order to handle disasters. It is a cycle because it is a continuous process. It is not something which will stop. It is required continuously. See, there was no thing called as disaster management. Disaster management ऐसा कुछ ही नहीं था. There was no idea of disaster management at all. So कहां से आया? The overall idea of disaster management came with the acceptance that we cannot avoid disasters. And it came with the acceptance that over a period of long time, the disasters are going to increase. The way we are developing, the way we are growing, climate change is going to happen, global warming is going to happen. The number of disasters are definitely increasing. This is a fact. And many of the times it is beyond our control. तो क्या करना है? We need to be prepared. Earlier, in most of the countries, the response was post-disaster. They were not taking any initiative at all before the disaster happened. They were just waiting for disaster to happen. Whenever there is a disaster, then they will rescue the people, they will rehabilitate, they will give some compensation, okay, rebuild, फिर खत्म. फिर दोबारा disaster होगा, दोबारा होगा. one of the most disaster prone country in the entire world is Japan. जापान इतना बैड लक कंट्री है इन टर्म्स ऑफ डिजास्टर. कोई भी डिजास्टर, मेजर डिजास्टर ले लो, सब हो गया. न्यूक्लियर डिजास्टर तो पता ही है, हिरोशिमा नागासाकी, मैनमेड. They are impacted by cyclones, they are impacted by earthquakes, they are impacted by tsunami, volcanic eruption, landslides. जो भी ले लो मिल जाएगा मेजरली. At the same time, Japan came out very successfully. Even though they faced the nuclear disaster, they came out as one of the very strong economies of the world. That is what we call it as resilience. Okay, they did not sit at home thinking, अरे इतना सारा disaster हो रहा है, हम तो कुछ नहीं कर पाएंगे. No, they started to face it. They accepted, okay, disasters are going to happen. Let's face it. Let's come out of it. Let's be prepared. चलो अर्थक्वेक होगा, बिल्डिंग्स कोलैप्स हो जाएगा, लेट्स बिल्ड अगेन. लेट्स बिल्ड सच काइंड ऑफ बिल्डिंग्स दैट इट विल नॉट कॉज डैमेज व्हेन इट कोलैप्सेस एंड इट विल बी इजी टू बिल्ड बैक अगेन. Most of the buildings in Japan, they are made up of wooden material. They adapted. That is what is being prepared. Now, if you are not prepared, maybe the losses will be more. If you are prepared, losses will be less. The earlier idea of disaster management involved only the response whenever the disaster happened. So gradually, the overall idea of disaster management was developed. Okay, of course led by Japan, which is basically the country which successfully handled many disasters. Overall, all the countries together, they came to terms, okay, disaster management is not only about post-disaster, it also includes the pre-disaster management and during disaster management, along with post-disaster management. There are three major stages in disaster management: pre-disaster, during disaster and post-disaster. In the case of pre-disaster, we have two further steps which are part of pre-disaster. One is mitigation, second one is preparedness. Okay, I'll tell you the meanings of this with examples. अभी के लिए overall stages याद रखो. Pre-disasters include mitigation number 1, preparedness number 2. During disaster there is only response, और कुछ तो करना ही सकते हैं हम. But post-disaster we have recovery, rehabilitation and reconstruction. Pre-disaster involves mitigation and preparedness. During disaster involves response. Post-disaster involves recovery, rehabilitation, reconstruction. Please remember these words very, very specifically. You should not use it interchangeably. You cannot use the word mitigation in during disaster, or you cannot use the word mitigation in post-disaster. You have to use only in the context of pre-disaster measures. Question भी UPSC में specifically ही आता है. They will ask what are the mitigation measures required. आपको तब लिखना है only those pre-disaster measures for mitigation, not the disaster measures in the post-disaster. बहुत लोगों को ये डिफरेंस ही पता नहीं चलता है. ठीक है. Overall disaster management is a cyclical process. Cyclical process means continuous. Whenever a disaster happens, before it happens you need to take certain measures. That is what we call it as pre-disaster. And whenever the disaster is happening, at that time you need to take certain measures, and once the disaster is over, after that you need to take certain measures. But after that you need to continue and be ready for the next disaster. That is what is disaster management cycle. Now come to the pre-disaster management. Pre-disaster management involves all the steps and measures required to be taken before the occurrence of disasters. So first write the definition of disaster management. Please write. It includes sum total of all activities It includes sum total of all activities, comma, programs, comma, programs and measures which can be taken up before, during and after a disaster. Before, during and after a disaster. ठीक है? So overall we have pre-disaster, during disaster, post-disaster. Pre-disaster involve mitigation and preparedness. Okay, this flowchart is only for your understanding. In the examination, in your answers, please write this one because you have to show it in a cyclical manner. Okay, पूरा cyclical manner में दिखाना है. This is for your just your understanding. So please write what is pre-disaster. Pre-disaster, the first one. These are the activities. Okay, this is number 1, number 2, number 3. In number 1, capital A, capital B. Okay, number 1, pre-disaster. These are the activities taken to reduce the losses. Activities taken to reduce the losses to be caused by potential hazards. To be caused by potential hazards. It involves mitigation and preparedness. Mitigation and preparedness. तो अभी बताइए, what do you mean by mitigation? What do you mean when we say we need to mitigate the impact? Mitigate something. What do you mean by mitigation? पहले होगा mitigation, then comes preparedness. Yes, good. Mitigation means to reduce the impact, to reduce the overall impact. That is what is mitigation. So mitigation involves all the steps required in order to reduce the impact of disasters. Overall size of the disaster कम करने के लिए, all the steps required to reduce the impact of the disaster or the size of the disaster is called as mitigation. Please write. It involves the measures required to reduce the impact of disasters or size of disasters. And it involves first one prevention, second one risk reduction. Prevention, risk reduction, both are part of mitigation only. All the measures required to reduce the impact of disaster, all the measures required to reduce the impact of disasters or the size of disasters. That is what is mitigation, and it involves prevention and risk reduction. Prevention is small a, risk reduction is small b. So what do you mean by prevention? Prevention is basically those events which can be prevented. So do we have any disasters which can be prevented? Any examples of disasters which can be prevented? Anyone? Preventable disasters. Flood, ठीक है. Not all the floods, few of the floods cannot be prevented, few of them can be prevented. Urban floods definitely can be prevented. Earthquake we cannot prevent, of course, यार. Earthquake तो नहीं हो सकता है. Landslide again, few of them can be prevented, few of them not. Drought, very good. Drought. Marriage is a flood. Who said that? Marriage is a disaster which can be prevented. Nice. So drought is a very good example for a disaster which can be prevented actually. See, earthquake cannot be prevented, tsunami cannot be prevented, cyclone cannot be prevented, and landslides, some of them can be and some of them not. We cannot completely prevent it. Floods also we cannot completely prevent it. Some of them can be prevented. Urban floods can be prevented, of course. And best example is basically हमारा जो drought. Okay, drought is something which sets on over a long period of time. Okay, drought will take long period of time. It will give enough indicator. है ना, बहुत अच्छा सा warning देगा. If you don't take measures, then only drought becomes a disaster. मतलब dry season becomes a disaster. Otherwise, you can still manage. Okay, best example is Israel. Even with one of the least quantity of available water, they are able to manage. है ना, their economy is growing. They are able to produce their food. Management तो हो रहा है. So basically, drought is a preventable disaster. So like that, there are few disasters which are preventable. ठीक है. Urban fires can be prevented if we take enough measure, but not forest fire. Forest fire, some of them are natural, some of them are man-made. Man-made can be prevented, but not natural. Okay, epidemics can be prevented, some of them can be prevented, some of them are not. ठीक है. So first one is prevented. Some of them are prevented, some of them are not. Prevention. So यहाँ पर examples लिखो. Through water management, drought can be prevented. Through water management, drought can be prevented. flood in floodplain if infrastructure are not constructed. See, 100% तो नहीं हो पाएगा. We can take measures. What if the river changes its course? पूरा कोर्स ही बदल गया, दूसरी जगह में फ्लो करना होगा, वहां पर तो फ्लड होगा. Okay, there is always a chance. What if the cloud burst happens? Definitely there would be floods. Okay, there are certain limitations. Prevention का example लिखो. Drought can be prevented through water management measures. What is risk reduction? Risk reduction basically involves reducing the vulnerability and increasing the capacity. Right? That is what is risk reduction, right? हमने discuss किया था. So risk reduction, please write, risk reduction involves reducing vulnerability and increasing capacity. Prevention का कोई definition नहीं है. Prevention is just to prevent. है ना? Example लिखो बस. Risk reduction involves reducing vulnerability and increasing capacity. That can be done either using structural measures or by using non-structural measures. You can reduce the risk by either structural or non-structural measures. So what do you mean by structural and non-structural measures? Structural measures involves the construction of certain physical infrastructure, physical barriers. There is some kind of involvement of physical construction. Okay, structures, that is what is structural measures. In case of non-structural measures, there is no physical construction or physical infrastructure का जरूरी नहीं है. Maybe something like policy development, research, training, building awareness, all of this, where there is no physical infrastructure is not required. The physical assets are not required to reduce the risk. So both are required to reduce the risk. Some of them are structural, some of them are non-structural. Risk reduction involves structural and non-structural measures. Examples of structural measures: construction of physical barriers, construction of physical barriers, infrastructures, etc. Non-structural measures involve policy formulation, awareness, education, research and development. See, overall we'll try to prevent any particular disaster. जितना हो सके हम prevent करेंगे. But beyond that, we will try to reduce the risk. In risk reduction, basically we will not prevent anything. जो भी होगा, let's try to reduce the loss. Let's try to reduce the vulnerability by increasing the capacity. That is what is risk reduction. For example, cyclone. Cyclone तो prevent नहीं कर सकते. We will reduce the risk by increasing the capacity, by building certain infrastructure which will stand in a high wind speed. Flooding हो सकता है, ठीक है, it will not collapse. We will build certain shelter homes. Sorry, shelter homes is preparedness. यहां पर है रिस्क रिडक्शन, वही है, बिल्डिंग्स विच विल विथस्टैंड द हाई विंड स्पीड, making people aware, okay, so it is going to happen. So if it is going to happen, what exactly should be done? Making them aware, training them, all of this is risk reduction. Then comes preparedness. In case of risk reduction, we are going to take the measures to reduce the vulnerability and increase the capacity. In case of preparedness, we will train them to what to do in the case of disaster. Disaster हो रहा है तब क्या करना है, यहां पर आएगा. इट्स मोर अबाउट अवेयरनेस. ठीक है, होने का चांसेस है. बी रेडी. तो बी रेडी का मतलब है बीइंग प्रिपेयर्ड. इफ देर इज अ साइक्लोन, ऑल द पीपल शुड असेंबल एट वन पर्टिकुलर प्लेस. शेल्टर होम में असेंबल होना है. राइट, इफ देर इज अ अर्थक्वेक, दे नीड टू एस्केप फ्रॉम द बिल्डिंग्स एंड go to the open spaces. That is what is being prepared. It involves training. Okay, keep writing. Preparedness involves training, development of warning systems, construction of shelter homes, conduction of mock drills, etc. Okay, there is a very fine difference between risk reduction and preparedness. You should understand, risk reduction involves the reducing the overall vulnerability, overall loss. उसके बाद में भी, even after reducing the risk, there is a chance of disaster. So when disaster happens, what exactly should be done? है ना? So when disaster is happening, you cannot train them, right? When disaster is happening, you cannot tell the people, okay, this is how the warning is given. ऐसे तो नहीं बोल सकते. When the disaster is happening, you have to keep them ready. That keeping them ready is preparedness. Best example is warning system. You cannot develop the warning system during the disaster. You have to keep it ready to warn the people. These are the different agencies responsible for warning different disasters in India. Okay, this can be a prelims question also. Please make a note of this. Cyclone warning is given by IMD. Tsunami warning is given by INCOIS. Flood warning is given by Central Water Commission. Landslide is given by Geological Survey of India. Avalanche is by Snow and Avalanche Study Establishment. Cold and heat wave given by IMD again. Okay, please make a note of this. So this is what is preparedness. See, overall, this stage is pre-disaster management. If a question comes on pre-disaster management, you need to talk about mitigation, preparedness. In mitigation, there is prevention and risk reduction. In prevention, there is structural and non-structural measures. In preparedness, various measures required to be prepared to deal with disaster. That is during disaster. During disaster क्या क्या करने हैं उसको एक बार ready रखना है. That is what is preparedness. दिस माइट नॉट रिड्यूस द रिस्क, लॉस तो उतना हो सकता है, बट यू विल एस्केप फ्रॉम द लॉस, है ना. यू विल बी एबल टू रेस्पॉन्ड क्विकली. This entire stage of pre-disaster management, this entire stage of pre-disaster management is basically, we call it as mitigation centric approach or being prepared. ये क्वेश्चन आया था ना, let me just show you this question. (2020) का देखो, discuss the recent measures initiated in disaster management by the government of India departing from the earlier reactive approach. What is this reactive approach? Reactive approach involve only the response and recovery. Reactive approach does not involve the pre-disaster approach. Reactive approach involves only the response and recovery. जब disaster होगा तब देखेंगे. Whenever there is a flood, we will send army. Whenever there is an earthquake, we will send army. तब बुलाएंगे उनको, right? But India moved from response centric approach, that is reactive centric approach, to proactive centric approach. मतलब before it happens, let's take measures. So that is what is pre-disaster management. There are various measures which are required, so that involve mitigation and preparedness. It is called as proactive approach. This is reactive, this is proactive. Of course disaster management involve everything. Reactive भी होना चाहिए, proactive भी होना चाहिए. ऐसा नहीं कि हम सारा measure ले लिया, जो होगा छोड़ दो, ऐसे तो नहीं बोलना चाहिए. Even when there is a disaster, we need to take care of it. This is proactive. Before something happens, you need to take measures, right? That involves mitigation and preparedness. Mitigation involves prevention and risk reduction. Risk reduction involves structural and non-structural measures. Preparedness involves various measures to be prepared. The entire stage is called as proactive approach, the pre-disaster approach. तो अभी आते हैं ड्यूरिंग डिजास्टर. ड्यूरिंग डिजास्टर क्या क्या करना है? वी जस्ट हैव टू रेस्पॉन्ड, और कुछ तो नहीं कर सकते. इंडिया मूव्ड टुवर्ड्स India moved from reactive approach to proactive approach or pre-disaster approach. ठीक है. ड्यूरिंग डिजास्टर क्या कर सकते हैं? ड्यूरिंग डिजास्टर बस कुछ नहीं, वी जस्ट हैव टू रेस्पॉन्ड. रेस्पॉन्ड मतलब बस उससे बच के भागना. You just have to escape from it. You just have to protect yourself from disaster. So response involve, please keep writing, immediate action in case of disasters, immediate actions in case of disasters, such as assembling at shelter homes, forecasting and warning, immediate relief, मतलब जो immediately जो चाहिए, okay, basic, that is what is immediate relief, etc. यहां पर ज्यादा कुछ नहीं कर सकते. Many of the times, whenever the disaster is happening, you just have to protect yourself first, then protect others. Right? But the disaster is still happening. But once the disaster stops, that is when the post-disaster come into picture. Post-disaster involved recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. 3 different stages: recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. What do you mean by recovery? Recovery is basically rescuing people who are stuck in the disaster. मतलब अर्थक्वेक आके खत्म हो गया, फ्लड आके खत्म हो गया. In that, many people would have been stuck. Okay, when the buildings collapse, many people would have been stuck in that. You need to rescue them immediately. जितना तेज, जितना फास्ट हो सके, उतना जल्दी. That is what is recovery. To rescue the people, please keep writing. To rescue the people, debris clearance, rescue the people, debris clearance, etc. So that minimum damage is caused to life and property. Then rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is basically temporary relocation. There are various locations which are destroyed during the disaster. Okay, buildings collapse हो गया, या floods के वजह से पूरा पानी accumulate हो गया, है ना? You need to wait till it goes back, right? You need to provide them temporary location, temporary shelter homes, and also provide them with the relief material. Right, all this process comes under rehabilitation. Okay, temporarily उनको relocate करो. Reconstruction is permanently building back. जो जहां पर destroy हुआ था, फिर दोबारा वहां पर दोबारा buildings बनाओ, फिर वापस लेके आओ. That is what is reconstruction. Recovery is very immediate. Then comes in the medium term, okay, relocating them and providing them the relief and medicine, etc. Then reconstruction. Rehabilitation involve temporary shifting of people to safe locations, temporary shifting of people to safe locations or shelter homes, collection and distribution of relief material, collection and distribution of relief material. Yes, of course, it also involves restoration of communication and basic infrastructure. उसको immediately तो restore करना है. Restoration of communication and basic infrastructure. then coordination of different agencies, क्योंकि रिहेबिलिटेशन में, रेस्क्यू में बहुत सारा डिफरेंट एजेंसीज इन्वॉल्व होता है, लाइक आर्मी, एनडीआरएफ, पुलिस, द एडमिनिस्ट्रेशन, एनजीओज, मीडिया, बहुत सारे डिफरेंट ऑर्गेनाइजेशन, डिफरेंट एजेंसीज आर इन्वॉल्व देम. So there it is required that they should cooperate with each other. They should coordinate with each other so that it will not lead to any kind of further loss. At the same time, we should also ensure during the rehabilitation process the gender issues are taken care, because they are put in the shelter homes temporary, right? There are chances of insecurity, there are chances of theft, है ना, और any other kind of mishappening. So there are high chances, because security तो बहुत issue रहता है at that point of time. Everyone are disturbed. So we should ensure that such kind of issues do not happen. At the same time, even taking care of the drinking water, to ensure that the waterborne diseases do not spread very easily, because large number of people would be staying at one place, right? To ensure the hygiene of the location. ये सारा चीजें जो करना होता है, that is what is rehabilitation. Fine. And this would be a very important task, particularly for our administration. जो आप लोग आगे जाके सिविल सर्वेंट बनोगे ना, so you need to keep this in mind. Whenever there is a disaster, it is the district administration which is responsible, headed by the DM or DC of that particular district. You need to look after all of these. You should ensure that the relief material which are collected is distributed properly. And many of the times there would be a very high corruption involved in this. गवर्नमेंट से पैसा आएगा, कहां पर जाएगा पता ही नहीं चलता है, एंड बहुत सारा डोनेशंस आता है. पीपल अक्रॉस द कंट्री, अक्रॉस द डिफरेंट रीजन्स वुड कंट्रीब्यूट. वो दैट इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट दैट यू शुड मैनेज इट प्रॉपरली. देयर इज अ हाई चांस ऑफ करप्शन, क्राइम, एवरीथिंग इज इन्वॉल्व्ड एट दिस पॉइंट ऑफ टाइम. ऑल ऑफ दिस कम्स अंडर rehabilitation. Then what is reconstruction? Reconstruction is permanently constructing something back. But it is very important that you reconstruct something in such a manner that the same kind of damage do not happen again. For that, you need to take feedback from all the earlier stages. You would have taken certain mitigation measures, prevention measures, risk reduction measures, preparedness measures. In spite of all of that, the damage has happened. Why? What is the reason? When you are building it back again, you should ensure that these things do not repeat. That is what we call it as build back better. Okay, build back better. This is the mantra of reconstruction. While reconstructing something, you need to take care that whatever the mistakes done in the previous stages are not being repeated. During the reconstruction, you need to reconstruct the entire infrastructure. जो भी collapse हुआ है, जो भी destroy हुआ है, वो सारा दोबारा reconstruct करना है, but in a safer and sustainable manner. Okay, please write. It involve damage assessment, वो तो चाहिए, without which you cannot do the reconstruction, right? Damage assessment, building safer and sustainable infrastructure, building safer and sustainable infrastructure, taking feedback from the previous stages, and accommodating future improvements. and accommodating future improvements. So this is your disaster management cycle. So this is very important part. इसके ऊपर डायरेक्ट क्वेश्चन आने का चांसेस तो कम है, एक बार तो आ गया था. Okay, let me just show you that question which was asked earlier. These are the two questions. अभी तो you can easily answer this, I guess. How important are vulnerability and risk assessment for pre-disaster management? Now since you know the meaning of vulnerability, since you know the meaning of risk and pre-disaster management, you can easily answer this. What do you mean by vulnerability? What do you mean by risk? Risk assessment क्या होता है? So pre-disaster management में उसका impact use क्या है? That's the first part. Second part, as an administrator, what are the key areas that you would focus on disaster management system? यही है जो पूरा cycle आपको लिखना है very briefly. As an administrator, you need to keep in mind all the three stages: pre-disaster, during disaster, and post-disaster. Pre-disaster involves preparedness and mitigation. Mitigation involves prevention, risk reduction, structural, non-structural. ये सारा ही लिखना है very briefly. Second one, vulnerability is an essential element of defining disaster impacts and its threat to people. How and in what ways can vulnerability of disasters be characterized? What are the characteristics of vulnerability? Start with what is vulnerability, characteristics of vulnerability, basically the indicators of vulnerability and different types of vulnerability with reference to disaster. But the different types जो हमने discuss किया easily लिख सकते हो. So question तो एक बार आ गया, but still this part is going to be very useful in your answer. Whenever you talk about a specific disaster, please keep these terms in mind. ठीक है? So what is vulnerability, what is mitigation, what is risk, ये सारा वहां पर यूज करना है in the specific context of disaster. Earthquake के context में what are the mitigation measures, earthquake के context में what are the risk reduction measures, with example आपको डिस्कस करना है. जब वहां पर बात करेंगे तब मैं बता दूंगा. ठीक है? Overall, please keep this entire cycle in mind. जो भी क्वेश्चन आते हैं डिजास्टर के कंटेक्स्ट में, you can use this framework and write the answer. Suppose if I am asking what is the role of NGOs in disaster management, we can talk about the role of NGO in pre-disaster management, during disaster management, post-disaster management. Pre-disaster management में mitigation भी है, preparedness है, वहां पर उनका क्या रोल होगा, प्रिवेंशन में कोई रोल होगा, रिस्क रिडक्शन में कोई रोल होगा, प्रिपेयरनेस में कोई रोल होगा, रेस्पॉन्स, रिकवरी, रिहैबिलिटेशन, रिकंस्ट्रक्शन, यू कैन राइट इन डिफरेंट स्टेजेस. So please keep this as the basic framework for disaster management question. ये जो disaster management cycle है बहुत important है. The terms are also very specific and you need to remember exactly like that. So that is your first part. Okay, first unit थोड़ा सा slow हो गया, but it's okay. Like the point is that you should understand the concept. So next class थोड़ा सा fast करेंगे because it is going to be a little bit factual. We are going to discuss about the various initiatives taken both at the national level as well as at the international level. Okay, at the national level various measures like act, policies, etc. At the international level various conference which has happened, and then we'll start with the various disasters of India. Okay, starting from earthquake, floods, droughts, etc. वो सारा डिटेल में हम डिस्कस करेंगे. ठीक है? So before you come to the next class, please revise once and come and be thorough with these parts which we have discussed today. Fine. I'll see you all in the next class. Thank you very much.